Good evening, everyone. Let's start our round. Let's not delay too much. Hopefully, we are all here. Hopefully, all the latecomers are here already. Anyway, let's not wait too much. My name is Sylvia Wynter, and I'm editor-in-chief of the Moscow Art magazine. And normally, I say introductory words before the lectures of this cycle, because this is a joint cycle organized by the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art and Moscow Art magazine. This is part of our partnership, which has been going on for a few years already. The presentation of every issue. Today, we're happy to present issue 101. All of the most recent issues over the last year have been accompanied with a lecture or a public talk from one of the contributing writers. We try to invite our key authors, key writers, who are a big priority for us and for our readers too. We invite both young and not so young colleagues to give the talks. So this issue 101 here on the cover, you can see the key topic, and just in case you don't know, every issue has its own topic. I mean, of our magazine, we try to focus on a specific matter for an issue, so we try to encourage discussion around this issue or this topic. This time is rematerialization and reterritorialization. It may sound a bit too sophisticated, but when we were trying to look for the most precise wording of what interests us, these were the best words actually that we managed to find. To make reading easier, to make this topic more digestible, we introduced a hyphen here. So it's re-hyphen and then the main word, just to make it easier to digest visually. Actually, this issue has been provoked by a lot of exhibitions of the past year, of the last year. And I must say that quite plainly, the issue that has been worded is that of the artistic practice and its tendency to incline towards the materiality of art production. Quite recently, our magazine was writing about a totally different topic, about dancing in the museum, and we thought that immaterial art was the main focus of the past years. And of course, the theory of immaterial labor and performance art and performance-related activities, we thought that they were the key issues of contemporary culture. But over the recent months, we saw that actually the material forms of art come back somehow into the spotlight. And we decided to research exactly these matters, these issues of the materiality of art. In a way, we see that it's not just a neoconservative trend. The second term you can see on the cover of our magazine, reterritorialization, and this is also very important to discuss new sovereignty. I think that everybody understands what this is about, especially if you follow the political life of the past few years. It's about going back to the local context, going back to the sovereign country states. It's important for the political debates of the present time. At the same time, over the past years, we have seen very active debates around the new understanding, of the locality and of how total the spaces are. If we take the representatives of new trends, they all criticize the globality and they replace the term globality with planetarity. Some time ago, we made a specific issue of our magazine devoted to planetarity itself, but if we take this context of going back to the matter, going back to the territory, to the local, we thought that it made sense to show the extreme, I would say, pole of this problematics. So our today's guest, Patricia Reed, suggested one of the key terms for the debate that evolved on the pages of our magazine. This is why I was very happy, together with my colleague Yegor Safronov, to invite Patricia. We beckoned her to come. We were quite successful with that invitation. It was very important for us to organize this meeting with our readers. I'm not going to introduce Patricia, because very often I take part in different international events, and I can see that while people read out my biography, the audience tends to go to sleep, because it's much easier and much faster to read the same info on Wikipedia. So I won't take too much time now. Also, most probably you've read the bio of our today's speaker on the Garage page. Also, she collaborates with the Strelka Institute, so Patricia is well known in Moscow. I think it's quite excessive to introduce her now and to read out her CV. I don't want to steal a lot of time from Patricia's talk, because we are all here for her. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and I'm quite happy to see a lot of faces I've never met before. So this is it for me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to pass the mic to Patricia. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the introducing the issue, and for the very kind invitation from Victor and Igor to be with you and to, take that labor of translating that essay for the latest issue. I'm also really thankful to Anna over here for all your amazing coordination in bringing me here. So it's really an honor to be at the Garage, and always nice to be back in Moscow, even in January, since climate change has made it more a little bit less brutal. And I definitely have to say in advance, and I know this is really awkward because the translator actually has to thank themselves in the thing, but thank you so much for the translation. Yeah, I know it's a kind of the bad joke, but I know that I'm really not a translator's friend, so I'm sorry in advance. And I hope everything makes sense. So thank you. So yes, so basically what I want to do tonight is, I can maybe go to this next slide. We'll start off nice and easy. It's the only thing in Russian, I'm afraid, because this was the diagram that went with the essay that they kindly translated. But yeah, so what I want to do tonight kind of extends from that essay, which Victor mentioned that maybe was made available to some of you. And this is, like I said, the diagram from it. So again, it does concern, in general, these kind of themes of planetarity, globality, locality, those sorts of questions involved in that. And, since we're in an art context, it probably makes sense to mention, I am coming from an artist background, not a theorist background. So a lot of these sort of, I just kind of delinquent artist because I got sucked into the writing and theory hole in the last few years. But a lot of these sort of questions, or I guess points of interrogation, were about just finding it extremely difficult to find ways to access our complex reality today. And then if you kind of understand complexity a little bit and kind of analyze this condition that we find ourselves in, to ask ourselves, what can art do in this context? Right? Because the definition of art is always changing, or at least how we understand the functions of art, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these sort of detours that I'm going down today were, in a way, quite personal difficulties or skepticism of like what it means to be an artist, why are we doing it, what can it do in this environment, and so on. So just to contextualize it for this kind of let's say museum type of context. So in the essay, so the essay that's published in this magazine, which was entitled Orientation in a Big World, it was basically about trying to submit the concept of planetarity to this question, what is the politics of location? Because one of the critiques of planetarity is that it's yet again going back to this sort of position that we can see from nowhere, that we're talking about totalities and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to get into some of those critiques, but also I think some of the mediation of that. So basically, in a big way, a lot of my text is a kind of diplomacy between the either or side of that debate. So basically in the essay that's in that magazine, it was focusing on the spatial or geometric transformations that I think are required for us humans to better understand what being situated means within this complex multi-scalar condition. So my talk tonight, and a lot of it's new material on the request of Victor because this essay was already published. So it is new material, so you're going to have to bear with me. Maybe a little bit not as polished as I would have liked, but I figured it's better to get it out and start a discussion because the questions we're dealing with, nobody's going to have some kind of total or complete answer. So let's just put our cards on the table and see, where we get. So basically, I wanted to continue thinking about the problem of localizing the planetary. And I'll be introducing that in terms of processes of worlding. And that is in order to try to make this idea of planetarity something that would maybe be inhabitable, right? Because I think right now it exists as this kind of very distant concept that we maybe grasp intellectually, but like, what does that concretely mean for our everyday life? Like, what does it mean? So what is the relationship between this big abstract knowledge and our behavior, our social norms, and these kind of, let's say, mundane human activities. It's basically in two parts. So the first part is more of an overview of what planetarity is and the sorts of conceptual and historical issues it raises. And the second part is more directly related to strategies of aesthetic production in view of this planetary diagnosis, which if there's any other artists or in the room, maybe this will be useful, maybe not. Maybe you have some total disagreements. That's great. But I'd like to just get these ideas out there. And so this is, on that second part as well, I'll be introducing a kind of new concept I'm working through on non-adaptive artifacts. So basically the general premise of the talk that is kind of the undergirding, let's say, assumption is that if planetarity is not just going to be another version of globalization 2.0, fundamental shifts in the frames of reference of our social and personal lives are going to be required in order to make this concept consequential at the level of social reorganization and a livable life. So this, to me, marks a difference between, knowing about the concept of planetarity, a concept, of course, that's largely born of, techno-scientific or earth-sensing apparatuses that have achieved this kind of diagnosis of planetarity, mainly in relation to climate catastrophe. So knowing about that, but then learning how to coexist in the consequences of this concept. This is a nice move from Kierkegaard was talking about the difference between having a concept and knowing how to exist in that concept. And I think today it's not enough to talk about existence. It's always got to be coexistence. So this, of course, tacks on to some broad legacy from feminist epistemologies that is maybe to be highlighted here. And that's basically the insistence on the correspondence between propositional forms of knowing or knowing that and tacit forms of knowing or knowing how, right? So maybe we know that of planetarity, but we don't really know how that translates into social reorganization. So now we can get on with the new stuff. So basically the point I'm trying to make is that despite this, epistemic achievement in identifying planetarity, that accomplishment on its own doesn't, magically offer a determinant guidance as to how to reconfigure or reimagine our models of coexistence anew. So this indeterminacy, right, this uncertainty, so we have the certainty of the diagnosis of the planetarity, but we have an indeterminacy or uncertainty as to what we do with it in practice. So this indeterminacy it's not a defect of an always partial and incomplete epistemic diagnosis. What it is actually the manifestation of a possibility space for social, political, and aesthetic intervention into how coexistence ought to be reconfigured. So basically what I'm suggesting is that planetarity needs to be seen as a possibility space, that it's like one that's cracked open by this radical epistemic determination of planetarity, but it is operationally and socially indeterminate in the wake of that determination, right? So this is, again, trying to avoid this sort of, you could say, I'm not talking about planetarity needs to be thought away from as a purely scientific determination, even if that is hugely important, right? I'm not trying to diminish that, but it's got to be thought of in other ways as well. So this is why often seeking answers in this turbulent indeterminacy, right? We don't know really what to do with it. It's a bit turbulent. So this is why searching for answers in this exclusively based on scientific or techno solutions is never sufficient. So it's rather because of the indeterminate possibility space that's, cracked open by planetarity that political, ethical, and aesthetic interventions need to struggle for claims within it. And today, I think it's obvious this is quite urgent because, frankly speaking, the 21st century looks to be perhaps the most risky century from the perspective of the human species. So these questions, I think, are rather pressing. So maybe just to begin, just so we can make sure we're all on the same page, what is planetarity in the first place? How is it different than globalization? And what sort of, real, sobering historical risks does it raise for coexistential reconfiguration? So, of course, I'm going to be a little bit brief here because any of these answers could easily be like a book unto itself. So we're just going to go quickly, but it's to kind of acknowledge some of the, some of these differences, but also some of the pitfalls we need to, or at least I feel like we need to avoid. And again, to also open up more space for thinking about, let's say, aesthetic concerns, since, again, we're in a kind of art context. So as I mentioned, planetarity is a concept that comes into focus from an Earth systems perspective. And this is from an array of ecological and climatic sensing and measuring apparatuses that are assembled into models of earthly dynamics. So from atmospheric particles to animal migration patterns to mapping deforestation to the melting of permafrost regions. So planetarity is dependent on stitching together these partial abstractions to produce an always temporary picture of this kind of coherent whole, right? So just as the microscope made the realm of bacteria intelligible or thinkable to human perception, even if bacteria, of course, pre-existed the invention of the microscope, so too can we say that planetarity only becomes intelligible as this kind of holistic entity due to an aggregation or this kind of stitching together of earth sensing devices that allow it to be seen and studied as a whole. And again, just to repeat, this whole is always subject to revision, right? It's not that we have this term planetarity now and it's forever fixed and that's what it means. It's always going to be in flux. That's the nature of it. So planetarity confronts us with the problem of thinking complexity and systemic wholeness. between bodies, entities, and importantly, temporalities, right? We've got the different temporalities of like human finitude versus like geological time. I mean, these are unfathomable temporal durations that we really can't grasp, or we're not good at it yet. And of course, this always brings us into the domain of nonlinear or non-mechanical causation. So this even just, particular observation raises a lot of questions as to how we may, how certain notions of our personal agency needs to be reconsidered in light of these complex systems, right? Where we can't just have these sort of mechanical cause and effect relations amongst us, or, there's always this causation at a distance. Yeah. And then I'll go on here. Great. So while this complex picturing of systemic modeling inherent to planetarity, it obviously seems necessary for projects aimed at mitigating Earth-wide climate catastrophe. In her essay, Becoming Planetary, the author Jennifer Gabrys points out that the dangers of perpetuating historical and imperial violence when thinking about planetarity purely through a scientific lens, which she describes as a totalizing distance, right? So this is this infamous like view from nowhere issue that she wants to make sure, without diminishing the need to think on this scale, make sure that we take on board the, seriously real historical precedents that this view has brought in. She's concerned about that, but also like warning us about thinking about planetarity as meaning something that's just sheerly about, massiveness and huge scale, right? Like that's generally the image that comes to our mind intuitively. If I say planetary, we just think like, whoa, this massive thing. And so part of the argument, at least that was in the last essay, was about trying to think of it as a dimensional problem, right? So that's this nested scales of existence that make up the planetary. It's not just this entire giant thing. It's composed of these different scales. So this totalizing gaze upon the planetary, as Gabrys warns us, risks evoking a sensibility that, everything can be regulated, managed, or centrally controlled. And this, she fears, and I don't, I tend to agree, that reinforces existing colonial dynamics and globalizing logics. And these, of course, are logics that have, been very much tied to scalar expansion, but they've been premised on inflating a, primarily particular Euro-Anglo perspective to this kind of grand scale of the global. And what that does is it leads to a picture of scale that's about enforced conformity and uniformity. So in order to escape this perilous historical precedent, Gabrys speculates beyond the strictly scientific origins of planetarity and asks, how may we learn to become planetary in praxis? So not just knowing that, but experimenting with how. So I think the critical inference in her proposal, and this is, I guess, for those of us invested in thinking planetarity and how, what are the consequences for governance and so on and so forth, is a point that was made elsewhere from Ray Brassier, but I think it's a kind of simplified or a simple statement of a very complicated demand, and that's the need to separate this epistemic totality, right, or this abstract totality that is evoked by the planetary, and social or political totalitarianism, right? To insist on the separation of the two, but you have to work at it. So when people are nervous, when you start talking about the word totality, you immediately jump to this political version of it, right? And so there's those that just say, well, no, I'm not talking about that, But I think you got to work for it. You have to show why it's not that, and you have to labor towards that direction of making sure there's a separation between those two versions of totality, let's say. So what's kind of paradoxical about planetarity is that developments of liberalization and subsequently globalization have, kind of forged this into conceptual being, right? Maybe 40 years ago, we would never be talking about this term. So these kind of forces, forged it coming into conceptual existence. But what planetarity reveals is a condition that's completely antithetical to the dynamics that led to its discovery. So by that, I just mean that the economic forces and concepts, technologies, and values that are inherent to the project of globalization have both produced the traumatic conditions of climate catastrophe, as well as the apparatuses to diagnose it. But what the concept of planetarity ultimately reveals is sort of untenable nonsense of those very logics that have created it, right? So seizing upon the possibility space cracked open by the epistemic diagnosis of planetarity, I think, it requires more than just pointing out that illogic, which is a more sort of, let's say, typical motor of critique for those of us, well, maybe not the younger, but of my generation in art, like that was the main function. What do? We're critical, and we critique is imagined to have a certain operation, right? And I think today that it's not enough to critique to point out the illogics or the nonsense of globalization that have produced the condition that we're in. We have to realize conditions for other logics and modes of sense making in order to create new conditions, right? Because one thing, at least this is, I'm not trying to demonize critique or something. I'm just trying to show that it has a certain limit. So we can sit here and be critical about something, but until, in a way, critique always needs to uphold the thing that it's pointing to. And I want to get rid of the thing that we're pointing to, if that makes sense. So while it's one thing to bear witness to this nonsense of our concrete moment, and I think it's kind of easy to say that it's not tenable, this mode of existence that we're in on the scale of human inhabitation on the earth. It's one thing to bear witness to the nonsense of our concrete moment, and that's a necessary part of working towards its deconcretization, if you want. But I think it's quite another to become witness to worlds that are not yet manifestly concrete. So these are worlds that don't lend themselves to experience. So we can experience the nonsense of our reality, but we can't. How do we witness that which is not yet in place? How do we imagine experience from the perspective of that which is not concretely there? And this is where I think it gets very interesting for art. But we'll hold off on that, but it's going to come. So, and again, while that premise of witnessing an inexistent world may sound just totally uselessly academic, I'd just like to point out that I think all struggles for betterment in many ways deal with this problem in some way, since a world that is better is not in the here and now of this concrete world. It's in a different there and then of another world. So maybe the terms I'm using seem a little bit like fancy and fluffy, but I think that if you just even have any sort of hope for betterment, for transformation for the better, and yes, who defines the better? These are all questions that need to be negotiated. But nonetheless, that you have the hope for something better, that means you're already trying to conjure an inexistent world. And so I don't think it's so weird to say, like, how do we witness a world that doesn't yet exist? So again, just to be clear on the terms and everything, what do I mean by a world here? The term world, I mean, you could take it in any discipline, you're going to get a million definitions, and it's a contested term. So I'm just using it here very simply to refer to a specific configuration of coexistence where life activities take place. So extremely simple. So that's to say that when I use a world, I mean it to talk about processes of localization, right? It's because what I mean by that is simply, everyday life plays out locally, right? Even if we have these big abstract concepts that we know of, and they should they have some kind of transformative effect on how we imagine ourselves, we still play out life in a local realm. and this is where this nice, from the quick wit of Gayatri Spivak, infamously said, we don't live on a globe. We live in a world, right? So a world appears to us concretely because this impersonal conceptual domain, it allows for a shared recognition in a certain way. So this impersonal conceptual domain, it then shapes our personal experience as a fusion of, quote, percepts, affects, concepts, and intersubjective relations in an impure mixture, to use the words of Gabriel Catren. So the perceptual codes of sense-making that make up this concrete world, they create a kind of conceptual enclosure or a kind of border, making it very difficult to see, think, and sense outside that frame, right? That's what, it makes it very difficult. When you hear a common thing like, oh, you're being unrealistic, or that's impossible, right? In many ways, that's just because somebody is very much bound to this kind of enclosure of what makes sense and what is imagined as naturally impossible, and so on and so forth. So we have to be aware when we hear those kind of things, like you're being unrealistic. It's like, well, maybe not, probably not. So this enclosure is similar to the concept of the episteme for those who are familiar with Foucault. It's basically that which configures what is perceived as relevant or irrelevant to question, what's possible or impossible to think, and how distinctions between sameness and difference become naturalized as categories of common sense. So all I'm trying to say is that this enclosure of a world, it conditions experience because it sets the conceptual conditions for experience. So the quality and types of experience within a world shape our intuitions, serving as a ground of self-reference through which ways of being, doing, and relating are justified. And by justified, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're just in the moral sense of the word. That's that self-reference. It's justified, it makes sense, because these are the coordinates we've set up as frames of reference, right? And to in our contemporary reality, for instance, let's say the role of economic growth as a kind of ideal, the force of that idea has on all decisions within human social activity, right? So you can say that's like one very primary frame of reference. Like, how do you make a decision? This is you make a decision in reference to that ideal. So that's all to say that, what I'm just trying to make sure is clear is that when I say a world, it's not the same as the earth. And the activity of worlding, maybe some of you are familiar with this term, the activity of worlding, the making of worlds, it basically requires this construction of new frames of reference through which other configurations of coexistence can be perceived, right, witnessed, and realized or experienced. So with that in mind, just to be totally transparent tonight, I'm working from the presupposition that the planetary has yet to be worlded, and kind of setting that as a problem that want to work on. And obviously, I'm here in a way lobbying everyone else to be interested in this problem as well, and work on it in their ways, in their way too. So the idea is that, so long as it is not worlded, configurations of coexistence will remain entrenched to this illogics of globalization, despite epistemic discoveries or achievements otherwise, right? Those will, until that we are able to kind of bring those into the realm of social reorganization, this planetarity, I feel, will just remain a kind of epistemic diagnosis. We have not yet been able to world the planetary because we've only been able to name it at this massive or total scale. So to repeat, it's no small feat scientifically to have come to this achievement, yet the social and aesthetic engagement with planetarity needs to invent ways in which, to quote the philosopher Nick Hood, human capacities of sensation could grasp the different dimensions of this reality in a manner that is meaningful to human existence. So to be clear, this worlding problem isn't about, I'm not arguing to simplify the planetary down to the immediate comforts of our human perceptual system as it is. That's on the contrary. It's about asking how some of our very intuitions and regimes of common sense are transformed and even utterly undone through the consequences of planetarity, and how we decidedly narrate the significance of them. It's about seeing how existing spatial, linguistic, and representational frames of reference that condition our intuitions, how they break down at planetary dimensionality, and speculating on how they ought to be reconstructed. So I think there's kind of two interrelated consequences of planetarity that I want to focus on tonight. There's arguably many more, but two major ones that we'll focus on in this talk, including a proposal as to how we imagine artistic production participating in worlding or localizing the planetary. So the first distinction is that the human-centered ideals that have driven processes of globalization have yielded planetary consequences wherein the human has become decentered as a primary agent, right? If you think about when I described the economic forces and values and so on that underwrite globalization, that gave us the planetary in a way, there's a very specific figure, imagination or self-conception of what the human is in that, and that's a largely like humanist version that we'll talk about later. Nonetheless, it's a human that is masterfully dominant over the world and therefore has the kind of right to just go, and the world is a resource for its benefit. So following Lukas Likavchan in his excellent recent book, and he's a former participant of the Schalke program, I highly recommend his book on comparative planetology. So rather than picturing humans as, quote, primary agents and masters, end quote, of the Earth, we are rather subject to and squatted by its forces. So this may be regarded as yet another Copernican trauma upon the sensibility of human self-importance. Obviously the first one being heliocentrism. Another one being Darwinism, where humans are the same as any other species in a sense, in terms of evolutionary forces. So many regard this as a Copernican trauma about the sensibility of human self-importance. And when we can read, as a kind of deterritorialization of the centrality of the human to sort of put it more along the thematic lines of the issue that's out today. So I think there's a case to be made between the link between a Copernican trauma on the human and its deterritorialization, right? We're uprooting it, we're deracinating it from the center. So to repeat this insistence at the beginning of the talk, however, this determination of a Copernican trauma, it opens up an indeterminate possibility space for reframing the human in light of this trauma. Yet merely stopping at the knowledge of this deterritorialization, right? Me just saying, human is decentered, go home, and as if we know what to do because of that, fancy diagnosis, without the labor of resituating or relocalizing the human in the consequences of this trauma, gives us no clues as to how the mundane activities of human coexistence ought to be transformed by this knowledge, right? So the question is not only how can this decentered self-picture be grasped on this kind of intellectual plane, but in what ways may we come to narrate meaning from it and hopefully discover some sort of purpose in it. So the second distinction, and this is has been laid out by in a very synoptic fashion by Sylvia Wynter, is to observe that as post-nuclear creatures, as she called us, now confronting climate catastrophe for the first time in human history, we're faced with the demand to coexist in an environment in common. This has never before been, we've always been able to isolate ourselves into little groupings and worry about our little region of the world. And that's how human, civilizations or cultures have, managed themselves. And this is just simply no longer possible. To be clear, when I mean, when I talk about, for an environment in common, I'm not talking about a common environment, right? So this environment in common is not about flattening it. is not to say that the threats and the experiences of localized bodies are the same in any way. But the point is to say that we have to be thinking about the environment in this kind of holistic way in order to better have accountability for certain actions, right? And that's becoming very clear, as I think we're all aware, in discussions on, just everyday life in dealing with climate catastrophe, right? Like no nation state, not even giant Russia. I'm Canadian, so like we know size, even our, giant countries don't have, there's not enough authority or whatever to actually, it's going to take this massive coalition in order to create, create change. So this is to me, there's many ways to look at this problem, but I just realized in myself in a really kind of stupid way, like I don't sense myself in the world in this environment in common. And what would it mean to possess the sensory apparatus to do that, just as a speculation? So I think that all I'm trying to say is within this kind of problem of what does it mean to, exist or to develop a frame of reference for this environment in common, I think it's also a spatial representational issue as well, right? So just to say, and I don't have any solution. I'm just like throwing out all the problems and I'll run home. So basically it's to say that, these we can't treat these risks and harms in isolated ways anymore. It's just impossible. And I think here it's worth emphasizing, and I'm kind of happy that Victor mentioned this, one picture of the local that we see today, which is why I think there is even a quite an important claim within the left needed for planetarity, is precisely this, in this turbulent moment that we're in geopolitically and so on, this tendency towards isolationism, right? The return of nationalism, return of ethno-nationalism that's happening on a global scale. It's not just a European problem, it's happening on a global scale. So kind of in the face of these turbulences, rather than seeking to transform, rather than like inventing these like common projects to contend with this, there's a kind of epistemic rejection, right? No one on the far right is even acknowledging this epistemic diagnosis. So it's not just morally bankrupt, it's epistemically bankrupt as well. And so I want to like highlight that I think that there is political stakes in making claims on this that are very much antagonistic to the sort of right populist narrations that are going on now, which are, what are they about? Closing down borders, like isolationist protectionism. And increasingly we see issues of climate being used for eco-fascist regimes, right? So like 30 years ago, if you were kind of like person interested in environmental issues, you could kind of assume they're a bit on the left or like progressive or whatever. We can't assume that anymore. There's claims being made in the name of the climate from an eco-fascist point of view as well. So that's why I think, just wanted to put that in a more sort of like everyday political context of why I think it's important, and why I think it's also important to make claims on a rethinking of what location is, right? I'm kind of sympathetic to the need to localize, obviously, but under the conditions that we've just sort of outlined. Right. So what I think is particularly important from Sylvia Wynter's work for our problem of how to imagine worlding the planetary is the way in which she describes human self-conception as being a primary frame of reference for worlds, and the way that reference point, organizes social and epistemic arrangements in its likeness. So all she's saying, for her, it's like basically every human culture produces an idealized human subject, and that serves as a kind of, let's say, almost gravitational force around which like epistemic orders, norms, all these sorts of things. So social structures, are designed around that kind of figure as the kind of like truth or primary referent. So she calls this genres of being human, which is a quite beautiful expression. So basically this idealized human concept, it kind of functions as a template for human forms and so-called proper activities, motivations, and behaviors. But as I said, it's an idealization that is materially reproduced through social structures belonging to those worlds that incentivize adaptation to this human genre concept that underwrite a particular world. So it's quite a powerful example of how an idealization or a concept becomes like entangled with material reality, right? Like you can't just see them as totally separate. So this is a self-troping feedback loop, or what Wynter, and she follows Frantz Fanon here, names as a sociogenic principle. So what that does is it effectively naturalizes a specific concept of being human, while of course excluding all beings and entities not in compliance with it, right? So this would be, she always talks about, she's coming from a decolonizing and Black studies perspective. So obviously this figure has been a highly racialized figure, but also in terms of like the way that joblessness is also excluded from this kind of category of an idealized human, right? So this always regionally specific human genre concept is, becomes kind of internalized as a fact of nature, and one that's often unconsciously rehearsed, shaping both knowledge claims and organizations of social life in accordance with this self-referential conception. So just to put it very simply, the idealized concept of the human, it operates as a driving force for broader social purposes, because it serves as a fundamental reference point for those systems, right? So I think, once again, some of these things that maybe sound like stupid and academic and trivial, they actually like bear weight, in the long run in practical manifestations. So in the present world, Wynter emphasizes this inflated dominance of the human genre concept belonging to 19th century European liberalism that now operates at a global scale. So the results, this results in a regionally, bloated, what she calls mono-humanism, that manifests more familiar in the figure of Homo economicus. So such an extra-regional concept, genre concept of being human has generated, quote, and this is from quoting Wynter, the lived and racialized categories of the rational and irrational, the selected and deselected, the haves, the have-nots, as asymmetrical, naturalized, racial, sexual human groupings that are increasingly subordinated to the figure that thrives on accumulation. End quote. So we humans, and this is something that's very powerful about Sylvia Wynter, is she really tries to emphasize us as both biological and mythological, kind of like equal parts of both. So she tells us we become subordinated to the myth of biological overdetermination. And by this, she means that we have basically sold ourselves in the story that humans are, quote, motivated primarily by the imperative common to all organic species of securing the material basis of their existence, rather than by the imperative of securing the overall conditions of experience, right? So obviously in that quote, you can read in the environment and common quite clear, right? So she's basically saying, yeah, we're more than just kind of, we've sold ourselves short if we are adhering to the myth that we're only interested in like in material resources for me, for my family, for the people I know, and so on and so forth. Like, why is that narrative so strong? And importantly, like without this, root conception, and you hear that all the time, right? That like when people are talking about capitalism, oh, it's human nature, we're all greedy and selfish bastards, and we just have to have this kind of system. Well, there's like no, maybe we're not, like no one can say that definitively. So without a root human genre concept, there's simply no ground upon which to justify the priority of private wealth accumulation at the expense of everything else, including, of course, in the extreme case today, the very resources required for sustaining, basic physiological life. So due to these habituating frames of reference, so these like create habits and naturalizations, and the way that they underwrite a particular world, Wynter highlights an important difference between the production of what she calls genre-specific orders of truth, as opposed to truths in general. So what she means by that is that if you have this kind of referent here, in the kind of the epistemological order that is already designed almost in sympathy with that frame of reference of the human, then you're going to start to produce truths that kind of confirm it, right? So that's basically what she's meaning by genre-conforming truth. And because of this tendency towards human genre-conforming truths, or one of her colleagues, Catherine McKittrick, put in a little simpler way, adaptive truths. We can think of them like that. They're, you can obviously hear the kind of pejorative nature in the term, right? They're truths that are amenable to a certain assumption of reality already, right? So they're already quite heavily biased. So because of this tendency towards the production of adaptive truths, Wynter addresses the role that intellectuals often play in rehearsing and perpetuating these frames of reference that structure the conditions of possibility and impossibility, inclusion and exclusion in a particular world. And I think correspondingly, we artists aren't immune from this either, right? So I think we have to learn to see our own biases and assumptions, asking, self-critically asking too, do they not fall into this adaptive truth category as well, which would be merely reinforcing certain frames of reference, including what we think the human is, despite semblances of being hypercritical or some kind of new shiny art object that appears, right? Maybe it's actually not that new. If it's adhering to these old frames of reference, it's not so novel. So the way that I want to kind of put this kind of argument now is, and we're getting to the more sort of art relevant side, is if we consider artistic production, and I mean by that even contemporary ones, in a way of producing artifacts, right? And artifacts belong to certain worlds, right? If you go to the museum, you see an artifact, and what is it? It allows you to kind of get a picture of a human culture at a certain moment, what the beliefs were, why was this imagined to be a functional, desirable object within the thing. So basically, it allows you a kind of vehicle to get into that world, essentially, right? Even if it's a world that is so distant from anything that makes sense to you today, right? So artifacts in general aren't just traces of human life, but they serve as vehicles to access these historically concretized worlds, making those ways of coexistence to which they're attached. They kind of make them accessible or intelligible to us, right? Like I said, we can see something, we can, we understand what kind of, what was a use value? How did a use value get determined in a certain human culture that would be vastly different from a use value or necessity value we may have now, right? We can learn about those sort of narrations. Right, so the point is to say, like, artifacts give us a sort of ways of accessing worlds and making them intelligible that may not have anything to do with our concrete experience in the here and now. And rather than thinking of history in this kind of, let's say, reductive sense of just, locating objects in an inventory along a timeline, these kind of objects reflect the discursive predispositions that underwrite certain worlds, revealing, I think, some of their frames of reference that are going on, right? I think that we can, through these objects, it allows us to kind of interact with the frames of reference that were highly influential in shaping certain cultures over time. So through the interaction with an artifact, we come to understand why a certain function was desired from an object within a particular human world, and frankly, to which picture of the human does said artifact or technique of representation conform. So if the problem of our moment is learning how to world the planetary, it's tied up with learning how to escape the conceptual and material enclosure of our current concrete world. So artworks and artifacts that repeat these frames of reference of a concrete world can be described as operating in an arrested mode, a kind of stopping of history, arrested historical mode of practice, since what they do is reinforce a kind of fixity of a world. They reinforce the world that we're in, as if it's historically totalized and the only game in town. So it's a reinforcement of the self-referential completion of a world that I would like to propose in the negative, the term adaptive artifact. So grappling with what it means to have a history, rather, as Reza Negrestani has written, is rather to work for historical incompletion, right? If we want to escape the given concrete conditions of coexistence, we have to work for historical incompletion of that world. It's to think, it's to labor against this idea that it's inevitable. It's to think its non-totality by liberating it from sheer monumentalization and to repurpose it for pathways unseen by the past. So an adaptive artifact is a kind of arrested historical mode of creation, since it upholds the existing discursive configurations as if they're inevitable, true, or totally complete. And in so doing, it perpetuates a sense of historical closure. So adaptive artifacts, basically what they do is they neutralize or naturalize the real contingency of a particular world by sort of like upholding or repeating naturalized ideals of it as if it's a kind of final determination. So the struggle for new worlds is equal then to the struggle for new histories. It cannot be reduced to a kind of fetish of futurity that we see very often from like Silicon Valley and that sort of thing. But it's also not a haphazard dive of unreason towards the unknown, right? It's rather the conscious reconstruction of the past for pathways untaken. So conceiving the practice of art as already the production of artifacts entails a sort of broader contextual consideration of their belonging to a somewhere and somewhen for somebody. That said, just as it is a blind reflex to kind of, rehearse or repeat the production of adaptive artifacts because they serve the common sense mode of self-reference of our current world, it's equally insufficient to just, bypass the condition of our concrete situation from where, we ultimately have no choice but to begin from here. So such a claim has a resonance with the theorist Nelson Goodman's ways of world making, who wrote that new historical world configurations, quote, always start from worlds already on hand. The making is a remaking. So remaking in this simple formulation of obviously a very complex proposition is ultimately dependent on the accountability for the trajectory from the, what isness, if you want, of the worlds already at hand to what could or ought to be as a remade world, right? How do we account for that movement? So in accounting for this movement, a distinction I think could be made between futurity as mere hype versus a project for constructing new histories. And such a distinction can be elaborated through, I think, two tendencies that we can see at work in futural hype and the sort of adaptive artifacts that get produced in that shadow. So first is something that I think we can call inductive stagnation. And all I mean by that is that it's where an account of reality is, it comes from a set of already known entities, including their so-called proper ordering, right, their categories, and where a generalized pattern is sustained, as total or true. So the really common example given here is like Europeans, before they made a voyage to Australia, to be diplomatic, they come under the assumption all swans are white, right? That's the truth. And if you would operate in this inductively stagnant way, then you come to the truth, all swans are white, right? And then, of course, there's a voyage to Australia. They have an empirical proof that this is no longer the case. There are also non-white swans. Therefore, the point is to say that if they had only operated on what was available to them in their locality empirically and treated that as if it's absolutely true, it's, of course, not. But basically, the more sort of like, let's say, important consequence of that today is basically that what there is concretely is treated as if all there, as if is assumed to be all there is. So basically, what is concretely before us is seen as all that is possible. And the other byproduct that is maybe more infamous of this sort of inductive stagnation is when you have the conflation of social categories as categories of nature. And this is something that Kate Crawford has talked about in her critiques of machine learning bias, right? Why is that inductive stagnation? You start from a data set. You start from already pre-existing, known, existing taxonomies of things, existing categories for things. It gets, statistically processed by a machine, and out, what do we get? We get sexism, we get racism, etc. Why? Because it's already baked into the data set. So it's basically confirming social categories as categories of nature, where norms become facts, and that's one of the other risks. So the second problem of futural hype is one that we can call the negligent leap. And this is this occurs when an escape from our present concrete world, avoids or just willfully neglects the laborious task of constructing this departure, imagining the remaking of worlds as if it's a degree zero proposition. So the negligent leap operates as if it were possible to begin the remaking of worlds from a position of nowhere and no when, right? This is just this kind of utter fantasy, as if we can just disregard everything of our present and magically dream of a new society. And there are more subtle ways that I think this negligent leap operates, and one is precisely to do with this category of the human, and how so? In a lot of discourses in climate change, we have the scientific category of course, we're all humans all of a sudden. Why? Because this species is literally under threat of extinction. But we know historically and socially that category of human being has been one of exclusion. In fact, where the majority of humans, sapiens, were never actively involved in that category in practice, right? So that's also, to me, a negligent leap, where we can talk about climate catastrophe and then everyone's like, oh, we got to get humanity can bound together because of this common threat. We're going to have to labor for what that human category is. We can't just assume it because, it's a scientific category, is all I'm saying. So I think this negligent leap is, it can be seductive because it's very efficient, right? If we say, oh, okay, it's really chaos now, we can all be humans now, we can forget about all that dirty history that we have because of this urgency. I think that's also wishful thinking, or even a bit naive. Because to leap from nowhere and no when is ultimately to evacuate what it means to have a history at all. So just to summarize, and I'm getting towards the end, thank you for your patience. To summarize what's going on in futural hype is either we have this blind reinforcement of these given frames of reference of a concrete world, as if they serve as a total or neutral ground of justification. Hey. Or there's a magical leapfrogging of historical concrete world givenness by departing from nowhere. So neither mode provides an account of nor accountability for the movement of what is of the concrete world to what could or ought to be of another world. So the argument here is that in the struggle for new worlds and new histories, that is the escape to escape the enclosure of the global. Sorry, I'm lost here. Is that in the struggle for new worlds and new histories, that escape from the enclosure of the global are transformed in view of planetary, we cannot fall into either of those oversimplified traps. So while this provides us a sort of negative backdrop for what we don't want to rehearse through this figure of this adaptive artifact, the daunting question remains, how one is to figure the creation of non-adaptive artifacts for new worlds, for worlds that do not yet exist in the here and now, while upholding responsibility to depart from a concrete historical configuration, right? So we have to depart from the concrete, but we don't want to remain in the concrete, if that makes sense. So for non-adaptive artifacts and their relation to new worlds, the problem is not only of figuring out the narrative consequences of planetarity, right? There are many narratives, it's up to us to shape them. And of course, as a decentered human, but of making them available to experience and interaction. So I think this can be outlined as a tentative brief for the creation of non-adaptive artifacts is how to make the realm of narrative consequence, which is a fictional or speculative condition predicated on what could or ought to be of the planetary, how do we make that available to situated interaction in the here and now? In other words, how can non-adaptive artifacts provide the conditions of experience from another world in order to make it accessible to thought? So in this way, non-adaptive artifacts are tied to the invention of what's known as counterfactual situations. So this is understood, counterfactual situations, as understood by David Lewis, can be outlined as, quote, an invitation to consider what goes on at some other possible world, end quote. So counterfactuals provide a cognitive play space to engage with and potentially make intelligible unknown worlds. They operate as vehicles for testing out non-adaptive frameworks for reference. So basically, imagine you would be, inventing new parameters, new frames of reference, and trying to imagine, what sort of artifacts would make sense within that world, is I guess what I'm trying to get at. So the proposition here is that through the localized interaction with non-adaptive artifacts, our minds are provided with just such an invitation to experience other worlds. In this way, non-adaptive artifacts can be thought of as prehistorical or ante-historical, not anti, but ante, like future, belonging to a counterfactual world, in that they must consciously reconstruct the frames of reference of a remade world as a speculative condition of self-reference. So again, imagine, creating a new work would require imagining new frames of reference and then trying to kind of like logically deduce what sort of artifacts that world would produce. So what sort of artifacts would be left by human cultures whose dominant frame of reference was an environment in common? Imagine that was a new scenario. How would necessity be defined, and how would that resonate through the objects that would be produced in that context? What sort of cartographies and maps would logically unfold from the perspective of a decentered human? And where would she locate herself, as a kind of artifact, basically? So this proposition also kind of brings on board, it follows some of the tenets of the artifactual mind thesis, which basically addresses this kind of reciprocity or exchange between external objects and the mind, right? So we can't really think of those two as totally separate. And the ways in which these artifacts, they activate new ways of thinking, previously unthinkable possibilities. This is not so dissimilar from the way that I described the microscope and how it allowed access to bacteria, right? This tool was invented in a way that produced the possibility to think what bacteria is, right? So this is, again, one example of like the interaction between the human mind, what is possible to think, and the sort of tools that we use to interact with the world, artworks or technologies. So as Siano Aiden wrote, rather than seeing a strict separation between external artifacts and the internal world of the mind, artifacts are continuously reshaping how we even understand our inner world to be. So artifacts aren't just external products of the mind, but they shape the possibility of thought itself. So this is why I think like the idea of creating vehicles, objects, what have you, to produce these conditions of interaction is extremely important, right? More than reading a paper. So the artifactual mind thesis names the process through which that entanglement allows for the creation of new sensory experiences, because concepts of the mind are shaped by interactions with artifacts and vice versa. So it's due to this relationship between the mind, tools, artifacts, and the environment that the agency of human thought may not only tinker with this escape route from the enclosure of the concrete world of the here and now, so like more of a critical perspective, but we can come to experience new realities. Like these are perhaps techniques that we can imagine for providing conditions to experience that which is not yet concretized in everyday life. So this capacity for remaking worlds is premised on speculative frames of reference and non-adaptive artifacts that invite interaction with with objects that derive from those premises and the new sort of configurations they unleash. So just at the very end now, to conclude, while there have been welcome intellectual and obviously scientific endeavors to describe the effects of this epistemic diagnosis of planetarity, those epistemic accounts cannot eclipse the necessity to struggle for the history of this planetary totality as non-total. That is, it needs to be subject to reworlding. So I'll be blunt, it's not enough to rearrange the furniture in this current world. Freedom from this current concrete condition and the modes of adaptation that it imposes is dependent on the freedom to construct new frames of reference through which new paradigms of coexistence can be meaningfully realized. And when I say meaningfully, obviously I'm talking about like meaning for humans, for instance. So any desire for betterment, as I had mentioned earlier, is in itself entangled with a battle to deconcretize an existing world enclosure, since, to reiterate, the better is always unactualized in the here and now. It's not territorialized in the here and now, accounting only for the here and now of what is concretely given, including the rehearsing of these frames of reference, is to impede on the realization of betterment. So betterment always belongs to another world, and it is through the fictional dynamics of non-adaptive artifacts where I think interacting with that possible other world can be experienced, right? To kind of bring it out of the realm of pure abstraction. So this possibility of betterment is inherently risky, as Negrestani has also written, since its actualization does entail a home-wrecking operation. Yet this destructive, deconcretizing implication fails to capture the joy in reasoning new frameworks for home invention, for world building that becomes intelligible once the given concrete world is finally mobilized as incomplete, unfinished, and non-total. So there's joy along these new pathways, as the mathematician and climate activist Alexander Grothendieck wrote, in the creation and giving shape to, quote, tools, utensils, furniture, and required instruments, not only for building the house from the foundation all the way up to the top, but also for copiously filling in future kitchens and future workshops and furnishing the home to be able to live in it comfortably, end quote. So when much of humanity, not to mention non-humanity today, is under direct threat from the consequences of the inflated home of this particular concrete world, one that in practice leaves millions homeless, metaphorically, literally, and socially, there's little hope in the reproductive quality of adaptive truths or adaptive artifacts to answer to a mess made by its frames of reference and resulting normative social commitments. It's a question of learning how not to adapt to this illogical, unjust mess, and rather how to invite interaction with worlds not yet concretely manifest. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you so much for your patience.
Дорогие друзья, если у вас есть вопросы, поднимите, пожалуйста, руку, я передам микрофон.
Hi, thank you for coming. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask what tools you think are, prioritized when thinking about this and talking about this with people who are still thinking about globalization and maybe how to access empathy and what route have you taken in the past to conversate about this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a huge question that you ask, and I think it also depends on like what field you be coming from in order, right? We all have different skills we can offer to a common problem. I'm a bit wary of the empathy angle because I see empathy as being very general. It's like kind of a ability of humans to simulate what somebody else is feeling. What you do with that empathy is not, it's ambivalent in the way that a master negotiator who wants to get you to sign a contract that is totally not in your interest will be so empathetic as to read you, and you know what I mean? Like in a way, like Donald Trump is kind of like super empathetic in that perverse sense. So I'm nervous about highlighting that because of course it can be used for extreme good, but it's ambivalent as a kind of, I don't want to put all the eggs in that basket, let's just say. The other thing that I think is really really important, and I know I'm saying this, I'm not necessarily doing it, and that's a problem, is especially if we're thinking about something like climate change, is that it needs to not just be an issue of, educated elite, people who think they can consume their way to, to like moral superiority or whatever. And maybe in this room that narrative isn't strong. I mean, that's like not a really elaborate diagnosis that I'm giving, but I think in a popular cultural milieu, I think that narrative is fairly strong. I think like that's why something like green capitalism holds, a lot of people. I mean, most nation states aren't talking about a radical social overhaul. They're talking about creating new industries, about, sustainable energy and so on and so forth. And which brings us to the other issue, which is like the need for this issue to also like get into a working class discourse. I mean, I'm sure it does exist already. I'm talking about, maybe it's better if I give a concrete example, and maybe there's sympathy in the room because we're both from giant resource-rich countries. But there's the tar sands in Canada. It's like a major oil depository. It's like the most polluting thing you can do, because it's not like drilling for oil. It's like chemically processing sand to extract the oil from pieces of sand. So it's a very expensive process. It only makes sense economically to do it when oil is at a certain price. But let's say it happens in a remote town that provides a lot of employment for people from around the world. People can have good jobs there, and people can make a lot of money there, like workers. But from certain Canadian cities, more cosmopolitan, the people who work in this industry are often just like demonized and like trashed and so on. But without, of course, providing any solution as to like where these, like where are people going to, if like tomorrow the development in these kind of areas would just utterly stop, like what's going to happen to this class of people who are dependent on these jobs and so on. And that's just like one example of, say, those who think they can like set this up as if it's just a purely moral choice issue, if that makes sense. So I think that needs to be worked on. And there's a book that I can highly recommend from a friend called The Sweetness of Life. And it's a case study, particularly on this issue in this city called Fort McMurray. There's 3 authors. I'm only going to say one of them. I apologize. But Johal is one of them. And it's a really wonderful book because it's also a collaboration of a political cartoonist. It's theoretical, but it's also a case study. So they like go and talk to, the bartender in the town, and they demystify what this, it's not even a town, it's a city. They demystify what this place is for people like me who are never going to go there, right? And they, and for people like myself, that would be easy to just like point fingers, like, how dare you work in this thing? So they complexify the issue. And I really appreciate that perspective on that book, not to mention the tone that they're taking of moving between case study, theoretical, and, political cartoon, like using like more popular language or something like this. So those are, I mean, I'm giving you more like the self-critique of like all the stuff I'm not doing, but I know is extremely important, and I'm glad there are people doing it. But yeah, I think, like I said, I think that for a lot of us, we have, different skill sets that we can bring to it. And I'm definitely going to be investing in the spatial sort of side of it. That's something that I definitely want to work on more. It is for sure more on the abstract plane, but I think we're also talking about producing change in different temporalities, basically, right? Like, and yeah, so I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. Can you relate of the diagram? How come that you elected it as a device, aesthetic and theoretical? Mm-hmm. what was the motive? Was it an art historical precedent, or the diagram's centrality in post-war thinking and structuralism, post-structuralism, or was it some particular author or artist that was formative during your education or coming forth as an author yourself? Thanks.
Yeah, no,
I must note that diagrams are especially persuasive, and I like them a lot.
Well, thank you. No, it's a great question. I mean, in all honesty, I came to diagrams more naively and intuitively because I was like an artist doing a lot of theoretical reading, and it was just a way for me to help to build connections. Like, you know, everyone does those little network diagrams of like connecting an idea and so on and so forth. What I love about them now is I think I feel like I don't know something until I can diagram it. I think there's like things you can do with words that sound good, or maybe you don't really know what you're talking about, and a diagram is a way to kind of like get to the point. And I really appreciate the diagram. I see it like, it's almost like a zip file, if that makes sense. So like it's a compression mechanism. And what's really great is like, you know, compression works in two ways. You compress and then you expand. And I think if you're doing talks and things, that basically the compression that you get from a diagram and then your narration over it is a way to, it's like unzipping the file because you're narrating it and you're kind of filling in. So, and I found it also helpful for the audience, I think too, that if you're using terms that aren't necessarily like familiar, and even each slide may at the beginning seem like, what is this? And as you speak, it starts to make sense. So I feel like it's hopefully useful as a communication vehicle, but also just from that compression side, I do like that compression of like the challenge of how do you wrote a 7,000 word paper and you can synthesize it in one screen. That's, I mean, it's a bit depressing at the same time, but it's also kind of nice.
Еще вопросы?
Hello, thank you for a lecture. I have a question that's maybe a bit naive or maybe even a bit contrary to what you said, since you're saying about future novelties, but could you call maybe some artists who you think create those non-adaptive things or worlds, new worlds who exist right now?
Well, I'm going to defer the questions because like anytime a theory person in an art museum starts to mention art artists, it's always like an endorsement and it's just playing into the market value. So I would like encourage people to think about what they imagine by this. And that's precisely why I kind of don't give examples.
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's not, I'm not trying to be like sneaky or whatever. And I would maybe tell you in the bar after a few drinks, but like in like the public context, it's just like, you know how it works out in the end, you know, that
yes,
like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Like throughout your talk, I've been wondering whether and where you locate care in and social reproduction in, if I might say, in your scheme, because you've been speaking about adaptation, and this reminds me of the ambivalence of care, and I just, maybe it's just me pulling out my own research interest, but been really wondering.
Yeah. No, we all do that. That's like that's a great thing. It's a really good question. I'd probably have more to say on the care thing than the social reproduction. I think care has to be, I mean, this is what I think is interesting coming from like also in like feminist theory, right? Because that's been one territory that's been like claimed, right? but it strikes me that it's been often claimed in a certain way, right? When we think about care, we think a lot about intimacy. We think a lot about like, even like biological relationships, right? Like your child or your mom or your immediate family, like, or caring for the sick, like there has to be some kind of proximity, let's say, loaded with care. And I think that in planetarity, we have to reconsider, like we have to kind of amp up what we mean by that. It's not to say that those aren't important issues. They absolutely are. But there's other versions of what it means to care. And we can't really, and it's also to say that we can't, the other thing too is like we almost like, it's almost as if caring is intuitively, we know what that means and what the corresponding actions would be to care. But we know that when we start to amp up the scale of what care is, then that's really problematic. That a lot of the things that we think we do that are caring are destructive or not fitting a geography or whatever, right? And so I think like there's I think this kind of need to be able to think care in a multi-scalar way. But of course, with the historical knowledge that when we have done that, we've done a lot of like good thinking we're caring about people and we're actually making things worse or it's ambivalent or having little effect. But that's to say that I think that care is not just about relations, about intimacy and familiar people. It's like how to care for unfamiliar things. Like why you should care that you should care, because I'm not sure that is even I'm not even sure that that's really active, that why would we care about X, Y, and Z is not so self-evident. And I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm getting more, it's new for me, but this kind of like extinction, these like extinction theory people, I think this is maybe an interesting avenue if you're interested in care. I don't know, I'm finding it quite rich. The X theory, or what is it? They're like...
I was kind of more thinking, I was I was referring to two people in this, to Irina Aristarchova and to Sophie Lewis, and their understanding. Sophie Lewis I kind of feel that she has started sketching those projects of the way care could work on a planetary scale. But I was also thinking of Maria Puig de la Bellacasa. But I just really like myself kind of getting to her. But I would really love to hear more what you mean about what you mean on those extinction. You mean Extinction Rebellion?
No. Like people that are interested in the history of humans being able to imagine their own extinction.
Wow.
Because like it's not like we've been forever able to imagine that human beings as such, as the totality, could be gone. Like it's taken many centuries and different different ideas in order to be able to grasp that concept, right? Because there's times where the universe is basically just a kind of reflection of a human, like the picture of the universe is one that's just like a reflection. So you already need a picture of an indifferent universe in order to entertain the fact that humans could wipe themselves out. So I'm in more by that because I was reading the author Thomas Moynihan on this, and the word care keeps coming up in a lot of things, like, because the thesis of that he was talking about, I'm not an expert on him, it's new material for me, but essentially that knowing this possibility is what provides the incentive to care.
Wow.
Right. So I'm just saying that if you're interested in it from that perspective, it could be an interesting complement.
Are you reading Spinal Catastrophism?
No. I just read other academic papers. I haven't read that yet.
Okay.
But nor have I read. That's why I would actually want to throw the question back to you, if you don't mind. I'm not trying to like offload work, but I'm obviously aware of Sophie Lewis. I unfortunately haven't read Full Surrogacy Now yet. I'm embarrassed to say.
Yeah.
I've been occupied with some other stuff, but follow her and watch videos. So I have a general picture, but it sounds like you have a much more detailed picture. Maybe you want to talk about it.
Could we maybe like after the talk?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, I have very small question. So you mentioned Sylvia Wynter and her inspiration by Frantz Fanon, right, and all this decolonial pathos. But what other theories? Because when you speak about world and worldling, right, it reminds me a little bit terminology of Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. So yeah, maybe you can talk more about some philosophers. Yes, sorry, I'm a philosopher by education.
Yeah.
When you speak about your ideas, thank you.
I mean, definitely. I mean, I think the Heideggerian, like, because it's like published about this, like it's kind of in philosophy, it's almost as if he's got the ownership on it. I kind of refute that. And I think that's what's given, like, so many people say, like, Spivak or whomever have been, when you say worlding to her, then she's understanding it as, like, the terra nullis fantasy of, like, white Europeans arriving and it's an empty territory and it's there for worlding and so on. So she's seeing it through that lens. But if you actually start looking at the term as it's used through, like, various different disciplines, it exists. It's like almost everyone gets to use it the way that they want somehow. So I'm not using it in any sort of Heideggerian way. I'm not a Heideggerian scholar. I really just mean it in the sense of, like, in this, again, in these processes of localization, like, how do certain ideas manifest, materially in relations, in self-conception that ultimately kind of structure society and allows for it to be inhabitable, right? Because you can't just have an idea and it doesn't just become immediately inhabitable. So all that I mean by worlding is like maybe it's even a kind of translation mechanism, you could say, between ideas and praxis, you could say, would be one way that I would be using it. I definitely have to do more substantial work on that term because I do realize that it can be controversial for many, and but I'm really meaning it. And in that way, I mean it is very ambivalent, worlding. Worlding can mean those things. It can mean, just because you say, remake a world, your remade world isn't necessarily better, or better according to who. So there's still a lot of indeterminations that are at work in that. And that's why I think it's important that we bring consequence to the kind of narrations, how we want this, how do we want it to mean, or what do we want it to mean? How do we want it to mean it in practice? And I think those, on that level of narration, it becomes really important. Like there's a book that I really enjoyed a couple of years ago. It was about scientific cosmology and international order or something, from Bentley Allen. And the book is precisely about how certain paradigmatic scientific discoveries through various forces and over time, how they end up becoming a motor of a certain cosmology. And so what he means, what he's talking about, a cosmology is it defines a sense of purpose. And he's basically tracing, say, European cosmologies from when states or bodies would be making decisions because their sense of purpose was for God and glory, right, at a certain moment. And now you have economic growth as glory, and that's the kind of cosmology. So it's a very interesting case study of, like, how these epistemic phenomena, or innovation, discovery, if you want, how they ended up becoming, in a way, like, how they enter just the kind of the general cultural sense of direction, sense of purpose. It's a very helpful book politically. It's not like a radical book or something like that, but what it is interesting is about tracing that movement between an idea and a kind of let's say broader cultural signification of that idea. How it transformed, how people self-understood, how social structures would reorient their sense of purpose as a result. It's kind of like paradigm shifts or whatever.
Друзья, нас немножко поджимает время. Наверное, осталось
Unfortunately, we
возможность
don't have
задать
much
только один
time
вопрос.
left. I would say that we have time only for one last question.
Ну, если вопросов
Okay,
нет
if
и
there
вы
are no
надумаете,
more
вы можете задать
questions,
лектору лично после
and you're
лекции.
welcome to
Patricia,
come up
thank
to
you
the
very much
lecturer.
again.
Patricia, thank you very much.